Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. At 7:48 a.m. on April 27, 2016, a babysitter in Hobe Sound, Florida, made a 911 call. Her voice was calm but tinged with confusion. Hi, I'm calling because Trisha Todd was supposed to pick up her daughter last night and never showed. Her car's here, but she's not. By 8:14 a.m., two Martin County deputies arrived at the modest rental home Tricia had moved into after her recent divorce. The residence appeared undisturbed. The front door was locked. Her sedan was parked neatly in the gravel driveway. Inside, nothing looked immediately out of place, except everything was. Her purse was still on the counter, cell phone charging on the nightstand. A plastic grocery bag with a half-empty container of milk sat beside a loaf of bread, both beginning to sour. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no broken furniture. But the deputies noticed something else. There was no sign of Trisha Todd. By all accounts, she had vanished clean. Trisha, 30, was a hospice nurse and Air Force veteran. She'd lived in Hobe Sound just under a year, close to her mother and extended family. Described as calm, private, and fiercely protective of her 2-year-old daughter, Faith, she rarely missed appointments, especially not a scheduled custody handoff. By mid-morning, investigators began conducting a neighborhood canvass. Multiple residents confirmed they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual the night before. One elderly neighbor remarked, "Trisha usually closes her curtains by 9. They were open when I walked past this morning." Detective Chad Cummings with Martin County's Major Crimes Unit reviewed her phone records. The last outgoing call had been made at 10:32 p.m. on April 26th to her ex-husband, Stephen Williams. No further activity after that. Detective Cummings noted the sudden radio silence. No texts, no social media posts, no banking activity, no movement from her mobile device after 10:45 p.m. It was as if she dropped off the grid at a very specific moment. They pulled GPS data from her vehicle. The car hadn't moved since 9:02 p.m. on April 26th. The key was still in her purse. Cummings observed, "It wasn't just that she was gone. It was that there were no breadcrumbs. That was unusual." By 1:15 p.m., Florida Department of Law Enforcement was looped in. Trisha's military service record was pulled. Her mental health screenings from the VA showed no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. Her medical license was active. Her hospice employer confirmed she'd shown up for all shifts leading up to her disappearance. No disciplinary flags. Her last known digital footprint, a Facebook Messenger message automated from an old Air Force contact, unread. Timestamp 10:27 p.m. Her mother told deputies she'd spoken to Trisha at around 8:09 p.m. the night before. She was getting Faith ready for bed and planned to return her to Stephen at a short-term rental he was using nearby. She sounded tired but not upset, just normal. But Stephen's timeline would raise questions almost immediately. In a voluntary interview that same afternoon, he stated that Trisha had brought Faith to him around 9:15 p.m. He claimed she stayed for a few minutes, then left without incident. He didn't remember what car she drove, what she wore, or even which direction she went. When asked what time she left, he hesitated. Maybe 10, 10:30? I wasn't looking at a clock. That lack of precision didn't sit well with investigators, especially given how meticulous Stephen was known to be. Stephen Williams wasn't just Trisha's ex-husband. He was a decorated Air Force tech sergeant with an impeccable logistics record. Someone who noticed detail. Someone who rarely made guesses. Someone who, up until this point, had no criminal record, but whose marriage to Trisha had ended under complex, opaque terms. Detectives began building a timeline from physical and digital evidence. They subpoenaed doorbell camera footage from neighboring homes, traffic camera logs near his Airbnb rental, and ATM usage from both parties. One clip, pulled from a corner gas station 2 miles from Stephen's location, showed what appeared to be Trisha's vehicle traveling westbound around 9:41 p.m. The timestamp matched a gap in Stephen's narrative. The video didn't show who was driving. Inside the Martin County Command Center, whiteboards began filling with possible timelines. Photos of Trisha, Stephen, and Faith were tacked up side by side. Post-it notes marked vehicle route, mobile blackout, and custody exchange were rearranged constantly over the course of the night. No one said it out loud yet, but there was a growing consensus in the room. This wasn't a missing persons case. By day's end, Trisha's home had been sealed off and forensics began preliminary surface testing. They dusted for prints on doorknobs, examined her toothbrush, and bagged the clothes on her bed. They opened her laptop. Her email was untouched. But something inside the browser cache stood out. 2 open search tabs for low-profile GPS trackers and how to record phone calls in Florida. Both opened 3 days before she vanished. Cummings marked it down quietly. He didn't say a word to the rest of the team. Yet, by the morning of April 28, 2016, the case had already escalated beyond routine. The standard 24-hour waiting period for missing adults had been waived. Trisha Todd's disappearance didn't follow typical patterns. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't withdrawn money. There were no notes, no arguments reported, no apparent mental health triggers. The digital trail, however, gave investigators their first crack. At 7:32 a.m., Martin County detectives received the initial phone location records from Trisha's cell provider. The signal cut off precisely at 10:45 p.m. on April 26th, within minutes after her call with her ex-husband. Her phone never reconnected to a tower. Forensic examiners flagged this anomaly. A device going offline in a populated area without being powered down or destroyed is rare. It suggested intentional interference. Simultaneously, the forensic tech team pulled traffic camera logs from State Road A1A and minor residential roads near Stephen Williams' short-term rental. At 9:38 p.m., a white four-door sedan matching Trisha's vehicle was caught on municipal footage turning west, away from her normal route home. By 10:16 p.m., a second camera on a private gate near Hungryland Wildlife and Environmental Area captured the same vehicle entering a restricted access road. This road led to state-maintained conservation land. No public reason existed for Trisha to be there. She had no history with outdoor groups or wildlife preservation. The timestamp was troubling. Investigators reviewed the Airbnb guest registry where Stephen was staying. He had rented a small unit off U.S. Highway 1 from April 22 to April 28, 2016. The host confirmed he had checked in alone. No other guests were listed. When asked if he had seen Trisha the night she went missing, the host responded, "I never saw her, but I do remember him carrying something heavy to the back of his SUV late that night." Detective Cummings requested all available surveillance from the property. The Airbnb did not have internal security systems, but neighboring homes did. One exterior camera facing the driveway, collected with consent, captured Stephen exiting the unit at 2:03 a.m. on April 27th. He appeared to be loading large, dark-colored bins into his vehicle. The footage wasn't clear enough to determine the contents, but the movement was deliberate. There was no hesitation in his pace. The containers were sealed. The rental SUV was identified as a black Ford Explorer, picked up under Stephen's name the morning of April 25th. When pressed, he stated the vehicle was used for work and transporting gear. Investigators obtained GPS data from the Explorer's onboard navigation system. Data logs showed a round trip between the Airbnb and Hungryland Wildlife Preserve between 1:45 a.m. and 4:12 a.m. That created a secondary anomaly. Stephen had previously claimed to be asleep during those hours. Back at Trisha's residence, forensic analysis continued. No fingerprints out of place, no shoe prints, no blood. But in the bathroom drain, they found partial traces of hair that DNA matched to Trisha. The length and quantity didn't suggest routine shedding. It raised concerns about forced cleaning or hurried grooming. Meanwhile, the digital forensic team combed through Trisha's browser history. She had not looked up any travel tickets, social plans, or moving services. However, 3 days before her disappearance, she had visited a Florida legal aid website. She searched the terms emergency custody filing and restraining order template. Those records had not been acted upon. No formal complaints had been filed with the court. Detective Cummings noted quietly, "She was planning something, and someone probably knew." Investigators began quietly re-interviewing close family and friends. A consistent thread emerged. Trisha had grown increasingly cautious in the weeks prior. Her tone was measured. She had started locking her doors even during the day. One friend recalled she once left a birthday party early, whispering, "I don't want to be out too late if I'm being watched." The investigation remained sealed from the media at this point. Martin County authorities knew from experience. The more contained the early facts, the more control they had over suspect behavior. As they compared Stephen's initial statements with newly retrieved surveillance and GPS records, the inconsistencies widened. He had insisted Tricia left his rental around 10:30 p.m., but the logs showed he didn't exit his property for nearly 4 more hours. And the route he took wasn't toward Tricia's home, it was into conservation land where people don't just drive for no reason in the middle of the night. Cummings reviewed the compiled data, unmoved by coincidence. "Too clean," he wrote in his field notes. "People who cover their tracks this thoroughly usually have a blueprint." Still, the department didn't jump. Hunches, even strong ones, don't hold up in court. Instead, they focused on systematizing what they could prove. Timeline reconstructions, discrepancy logs, cross-device correlations, GPS versus phone tower positioning, one fact at a time. Each data point served as one more nail or one more escape hatch. At the end of that day, they made a decision. Stephen Williams would be asked to come back for a second interview, this time with the complete forensic timeline on the table. But not yet. There was still one more element to clarify: the security logs of Stephen's own military access card. If any data there contradicted his story, it could tighten the case before any charges were filed. But inside the task force war room, no one used the word murder. Not yet. The official language remained: missing person, foul play suspected. But everyone in the room knew what they were really chasing now. Not a missing woman, a missing body. By April 29, 2016, Martin County investigators had built a rough timeline. But the gaps stood out more than the structure. Tricia Todd's movements on the night of her disappearance were mapped down to the minute until 10:45 p.m. After that, nothing. Detective Chad Cummings and his team weren't just hunting for where she went. They were now isolating who else had the ability, the access, and the control to remove every trace without triggering immediate suspicion. At 9:20 a.m., an inquiry was submitted to the Department of Defense. Stephen Williams, Tricia's ex-husband, was still a contracted technician under military jurisdiction. That meant he retained active credentials, including card-based access to classified zones. The question was whether those credentials had been used during the window of Tricia's disappearance. The DoD responded the same day. According to the automated entry log, Stephen had not accessed any military facility from April 25th to April 28th. That ruled out time spent on base. But buried deeper in the metadata was something less expected. Between 3:17 a.m. and 3:29 a.m. on April 27th, the night Tricia vanished, Stephen's work-issued device logged a system diagnostic. That ping came from a rural cellular tower outside the Hungryland Wildlife Preserve. The device had no reason to be there. It wasn't GPS tagged to his home, his rental, or any worksite. Its signal bounced between two towers before going dark again. This confirmed prior GPS evidence from the Ford Explorer, but added another layer. Stephen's work device had accompanied him to the area where Tricia's digital trail ended. Inside the sheriff's office, the case file thickened. Surveillance logs, phone data, and vehicle tracking now pointed to one individual. But it still wasn't enough for an arrest. No body, no weapon, no blood. So investigators turned to trace forensics. The Ford Explorer had been seized earlier in the week under a sealed warrant. It was undergoing detailed analysis at the department's forensic garage. Vacuum samples pulled from the rear cargo area revealed trace amounts of a clear, viscous liquid, later confirmed as diluted sulfuric acid, highly corrosive and consistent with industrial-grade cleaning agents. More telling was the abrasion pattern on the interior plastic lining. Ultraviolet light showed surface etching in swirled patterns, suggesting chemical scrubbing. When compared to standard vehicle cleaning profiles, the abrasions were excessive. Forensic techs also uncovered a small black plastic fiber wedged beneath the left rear seat bracket. It matched no component from the SUV's upholstery. Upon further testing, it was found to be consistent with composite polymer storage bins, the type used in industrial environments for liquid transport or containment. The team entered these findings into the internal report with a new working hypothesis. The SUV had been used to move both a person and chemical agents capable of destroying forensic evidence. Detectives re-interviewed Stephen at 4:40 p.m. that afternoon, this time in a formal setting. He was not under arrest. He was read his rights. He waived counsel. Stephen restated his earlier claim. Tricia had dropped off their daughter, stayed less than an hour, and left without incident. When confronted with the traffic camera footage showing Trisha's vehicle entering the conservation area later that night, he claimed ignorance. "I don't know where she went after she left me." Detective Cummings paused before presenting the GPS data from Stephen's own vehicle. Stephen didn't flinch, but what came next forced a shift in tone. "Your work tablet pinged cell towers at 3:17 a.m. in the exact region her phone shut off. That's not a coincidence." Stephen paused. "I didn't take the tablet out that night. We have a log that says otherwise." He didn't respond further. The interview ended. By standard procedures, the team knew what had to happen next. Secure Stephen's personal devices, including his home desktop and backups, before that data disappeared too. That same evening, officers served a secondary warrant. While executing it, they retrieved an external hard drive labeled AF Work Archive. Inside, one file stood out, a cached folder of deleted media, partially recovered using data reconstruction tools. One photo remained intact. A time-stamped image showed a white plastic bin inside what appeared to be a wooded area. The background was consistent with Hungryland's eastern entrance. No person was visible in the image, but the digital signature placed its creation at 4:01 a.m., April 27th. The image was forwarded to the crime lab for metadata authentication. No filters, no edits, pure capture. At this point, the case had crossed a threshold. They weren't just documenting inconsistencies, they were uncovering deliberate concealment, coordinated use of acid, digital redirection, and physical relocation. What remained uncertain was whether Stephen had acted alone or if someone else had assisted in planning or execution. Investigators took stock of the emerging profile, a disciplined individual with military training, access to corrosive substances, technical expertise, and a personal motive rooted in custody friction. There was a child in the middle. There had been prior tension about parental rights. Legal filings had been discussed. It became evident that this case wasn't about rage. It was about control. At 6:30 a.m. on April 30th, 2016, the Operation Perimeter was established. Hungryland Wildlife and Environmental Area, a 16,000-acre preserve spanning Martin and Palm Beach counties, had become the new focal point of the Trisha Todd case. The forensic data from the GPS tracker, vehicle navigation logs, and work-issued device triangulated to one key sector, a crude service trail off Canal Point Road. This wasn't a hiking route or picnic spot. It was remote, patchy, and primarily accessed by conservation staff or hunters during off-season. The Martin County Sheriff's Office initiated a coordinated search protocol, Phase 1. The first priority, high-probability zones determined by last GPS pings. 2 cadaver dog teams were deployed. Each K9 was cross-trained for both surface and shallow grave detection. Handlers operated on grid lines marked in 30-meter intervals using aerial imaging overlays. Within the first 2 hours, both dogs alerted on the same section, approximately 40 yards off a service trail under sparse palmettos. Soil disturbance wasn't obvious to the naked eye, but ground-penetrating radar, GPR, revealed void pockets under the top layer, irregular in shape. The search was paused. A forensic geologist examined the site. Moisture readings were inconsistent with surrounding earth. GPR signals bounced back fragmented, indicative of non-organic obstruction, possibly a container. At 10:42 a.m., excavation began under full chain of custody recording. What emerged within the hour wasn't a body, but partial plastic debris, white polymer, consistent with the same bin material found inside Stephen's SUV. No remains were recovered in that exact spot, but the forensic team didn't consider it a failure. The container showed chemical scoring. Residue tested positive for low-concentration sulfuric acid, the same compound recovered from the Explorer's cargo lining. This confirmed at least one physical link between the suspect's vehicle and the site. The container had been used in situ, not just for transport. Phase 2 of the search expanded to a half-mile radius around the bin recovery site. Soil samples were taken every 25 meters. Airborne decomposition sensors, equipped to detect trace volatile organic compounds, were deployed at tree canopy level. These weren't standard tools in missing persons cases, but this wasn't standard. That afternoon, a secondary cadaver alert occurred near a retention culvert, 300 meters east of the first site. GPR confirmed subsurface disturbance. Dig teams moved in with forensic anthropologists on standby. At 2:07 p.m., bone fragments were exposed. Long, thin, compromised by exposure and chemical degradation. Partial dental patterns remained, but no full skull. The remains were transported under seal to the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's office for full identification and chemical analysis. No one at the scene spoke unnecessarily. The gravity of recovery was understood. This wasn't closure, it was verification. While the lab results were pending, analysts reviewed the exact route Stephen had taken. The path to the two dig sites matched his explorer's GPS data within a 12-foot margin. There was no deviation, no accidental overlap. This wasn't panic-driven disposal, it was calculated placement. Stephen wasn't arrested yet, but internally the language changed. No longer suspect, now primary actor. Cases like this often rest not on what's visible, but on what remains. And in this case, even the soil told a story. Chemical erosion, polymer stress, heat variance, all signs of deliberate concealment. On May 2, 2016, the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's office confirmed what investigators already suspected. The bone fragments recovered near the retention culvert belonged to Tricia Todd. Positive identification was made through dental record comparison and mitochondrial DNA extracted from degraded tissue samples. The announcement wasn't made to the public. Not yet. Detectives needed to control the narrative until the forensic report was complete. The autopsy wouldn't provide a full cause of death. There wasn't enough remaining tissue for that. But what they did find was significant. Traces of sulfuric acid had penetrated the outer layers of the recovered bones. In some areas, microscopic etching indicated prolonged exposure. That aligned with the chemical residue in the SUV and the damaged storage container. There were no bullet wounds or knife marks, but portions of the tibia and femur showed unnatural separations, likely caused by mechanical force. Not decomposition, not wildlife. A forensic anthropologist from the University of Florida reviewed the results alongside local officials. Her analysis was clear. This wasn't an accident, and the body hadn't been left to decay naturally. It had been processed. Investigators cross-referenced the markings with hardware inventory data. A few days prior, Stephen had purchased a portable electric saw from a home supply store. The receipt was in his email trash folder, time-stamped April 24th. The cutting pattern on the bone matched that of a fine-toothed, oscillating blade. At this stage, the case had moved past suspicion. The physical evidence tied Stephen Williams to the body disposal site, to the container, and to the tool that likely caused the dismemberment. But they still needed to close the loop. Digital forensic analysis of Stephen's devices turned up a deleted file, an audio memo dated the morning of April 27th. It was brief, 4 seconds. Static, then silence, then a faint metallic scrape. Forensic audio specialists couldn't confirm what the sound was, but the timestamp placed it within 2 hours of Tricia's likely time of death. The district attorney's office reviewed the full case file that afternoon. While the autopsy could not conclusively determine how Tricia died, it no longer mattered. The evidence trail, chemical, digital, geographic, formed a closed circuit. Legally, that was enough, and ethically, it had to be. When law enforcement delivered the news to Tricia's mother, the exchange was simple. No dramatic reveals, just facts. The family had a right to know before the public did. The investigation had become a homicide case, officially. This chapter of the case wasn't about locating a killer anymore. It was about proving a system had been used, calculated steps to destroy evidence and erase a human being. But it didn't work, not because the attempt lacked intelligence, but because even clean operations leave behind noise. Minute traces of effort, exposure, pressure. By May 4, 2016, the investigative timeline was no longer hypothetical. Every forensic lead had converged. GPS logs, chemical evidence, the container fragments, the bone damage, and the deleted receipt from the tool purchase. All findings placed Stephen Williams at the disposal site during the critical time window, using means both traceable and targeted. Martin County investigators scheduled one final interview, not exploratory, strategic. Stephen was brought into the interview room at 11:02 a.m. The conversation was recorded, monitored, and legally structured. No accusations were read outright. Instead, investigators focused on sequence reconstruction, pressing him to walk through the hours he previously claimed not to remember. He repeated his earlier version. Tricia dropped off Faith, stayed for a short time, left. He went to bed. Nothing new. But the interview wasn't about eliciting new statements. It was about exposing fractures in the old ones. Detective Cummings presented the photo. The bin, time-stamped, matching the one recovered at Hungryland. Then the purchase history of the saw. Then the digital log of the deleted voice memo. Finally, the autopsy findings, bone separation from tool-induced force, chemical erosion, DNA confirmation. There was no reaction from Stephen. Legally, he wasn't required to respond, and he didn't. But the silence wasn't protective anymore. It was tactical collapse. 3 hours later, based on a coordinated decision between the state attorney's office and Martin County Sheriff's Department, Stephen Williams was formally arrested and charged with second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and evidence tampering. The arrest was quiet. No media alert, no perp walk. He was taken into custody from the station itself. Tricia Todd's family was notified first. Prosecutors were careful in wording. Though they believed the murder was premeditated, the lack of an intact body and a cause of death made first-degree charges legally vulnerable. A second-degree charge, deliberate, not necessarily pre-planned, was more likely to hold in court. Later that week, in a closed-door pretrial negotiation, Stephen's defense team proposed a plea deal. He would fully disclose the location of the remaining body parts and provide details of the incident in exchange for a sentence of no more than 35 years. The court reviewed the proposal with law enforcement and Tricia's immediate family. They accepted. It wasn't closure, but it was containment. Stephen provided exact coordinates, a second location inside the preserve. Human remains were recovered, dismembered, heavily degraded, but matching prior forensic patterns. The scene was consistent with an attempt to obscure primary evidence under environmental stressors. It didn't work. From a legal standpoint, the case was now fully closed. Stephen Williams pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on July 14, 2016, in a Martin County courtroom. He was sentenced to 35 years without parole. No statement, no apology. The plea avoided a full trial, but it preserved the truth. What remained in the aftermath was not only a resolved homicide, but a clear example of modern forensic convergence. How digital trace, chemical breakdown, and behavioral inconsistency build a case, even when conventional evidence like motive or weapon are lacking. Behind every case file is a person. That matters. But in court, it's the chain of evidence that holds, and in this case, it did. On July 14, 2016, inside a Martin County courtroom, Stephen Williams entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. No jury, no witnesses called. The facts had already spoken, louder than any testimony he might offer. He was sentenced to 35 years in state prison, no parole, no chance of early release. As part of the plea agreement, he provided the final burial site and a basic statement of events. But it wasn't a confession. It was a transaction. There was no visible reaction from him during sentencing. No acknowledgement of what had been taken. No remorse recorded in the official transcript. Just a signature on the deal, a nod to the court, and the end of a process that began with a mother who never showed up to pick up her daughter. The legal team for the state considered it a strategic win. Without a clear cause of death, no gun, no knife, no definitive trauma, the case risked collapsing at trial despite the strength of circumstantial evidence. A jury might sympathize, but reasonable doubt can rest in the absence of a single fact. The prosecution had built the case on science, forensic chemistry, digital timestamp correlation, trace polymer transfer, and GPS data mapping. But even the best evidence doesn't guarantee a conviction when a defense team frames uncertainty as absence. The plea eliminated that risk. Behind the scenes, this decision weighed heavily. Tricia's mother had hoped for a trial, for answers, but she understood the limits of what the law could do. Justice in this case wouldn't come with a confession. It would come with containment. The man who killed her daughter wouldn't walk free again. Not for decades, not until her granddaughter was grown. Faith, just a toddler at the time of Trisha's disappearance, was shielded from the media. She was relocated to live with her maternal grandmother. Later, a name change would be filed. Schools, addresses, and records were sealed for safety. She wouldn't grow up with her father's name. The impact on Trisha's extended family rippled in less visible ways. Siblings withdrew from public life. Friends who once rallied during the search grew quiet as the details emerged. A few refused to hear the full report. What Stephen did after the murder, the dismemberment, the chemical attempts at dissolution, was more than brutal. It was systematic. Prosecutors described it as organized removal, a phrase that stuck with the task force more than any single image. There was no official memorial, no headstone, only cremated remains and a private service in a backyard garden where Trisha once liked to sit. Her family chose not to hold a funeral in a public venue, citing both media attention and their desire to avoid re-traumatizing Faith in years to come. From a forensic standpoint, the case gained quiet recognition within professional circles. It was studied in law enforcement training as an example of successful conviction without a body in full, without a murder weapon, and without a verbal confession. What held the case together was consistency across multiple disciplines: digital forensics, chemical analysis, anthropology, behavioral sequencing. Internally, the Martin County Sheriff's Office filed a 62-page procedural brief titled Todd Homicide, Evidence Chain in Absence of Cause. The report emphasized decision-making under uncertainty, the use of cadaver dogs in chemically altered terrain, and challenges in charging when pathology is compromised. More than that, the case raised legal questions about proportionality. Should sentencing reflect what could be proved or what was believed? Second-degree murder fit the statute, but in the public mind, the act seemed premeditated, controlled, and cruel. The plea didn't erase those perceptions. Community response was restrained but clear. A small vigil was held in front of the sheriff's department. Not many people spoke. One woman left a handwritten note under a candle. She mattered, even if he tried to make her vanish. Perhaps the most lasting impact was cultural, not legal. The case reminded investigators and prosecutors that violent control can look clean. That erasure is a form of power some perpetrators pursue, not out of rage but out of strategy, and that even without traditional markers, the truth leaves a forensic trail. In cases like this, what's missing often tells the most. The plea deal was done. The sentence was final. Stephen Williams would serve 35 years for the second-degree murder of Trisha Todd. There would be no trial, no appeal, no retrial. From a legal perspective, the case was closed. But outside court filings, its weight didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, the case was dissected, not in tabloid headlines, but in classrooms and training seminars. Investigators across the country studied how a conviction had been secured without a murder weapon, without a complete body, and without an explicit confession. What made the difference wasn't a single breakthrough. It was the structure: small, consistent, verifiable facts that built a forensic wall too coherent to ignore. This case reshaped how prosecutors approach body destruction homicides. It proved that meticulous concealment doesn't neutralize evidence. GPS traces, polymer fibers, purchase receipts, and acid residue. Each element on its own was weak. Together, they told a story stronger than silence. But the public didn't rally around the science. They remembered the human center. Trisha Todd wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't known beyond her small community before she vanished. But she became a symbol of resilience, not in life, but in the pursuit of truth after death. The way her case was handled set a quiet precedent. Even when a victim is methodically erased, justice can still materialize. There were no documentaries, no viral campaigns, just a modest vigil and a message written on poster board outside the sheriff's office. She mattered. She was found. That's enough. Faith Todd, now under the protection of extended family, would never grow up with her mother, but she would grow up with the knowledge that people didn't stop looking, that even when the truth was dismantled, piece by piece, it was still put back together. This wasn't a story about rage or chaos. It was about control and what it takes to break it. Stephen tried to eliminate every trace, but trace evidence, chemical, digital, human, outlasted him. And in cases like this, what survives isn't the crime. It's the record. Sometimes justice doesn't come with all the answers. It comes with the willingness not to look away. If there's one thing I've learned from this story, it's that truth leaves traces, even when someone tries to erase them. You don't have to be famous to matter. Trisha Todd mattered because someone kept asking questions, because a system didn't quit, because love doesn't disappear when a person does. Now I'd like to hear from you. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Did it remind you of something in your own life? Or maybe you're watching from a small town like Hobe Sound? Tell me where you're from. And if this video made you stop and think, please hit subscribe so you won't miss the next case we cover. Your voice matters here. Let's keep the conversation going.